Hi, it's Karen, and welcome to this episode of Changing Rain. I'm just giving you a little heads up intro to our guest this week. It's Dr. Jake Veasey, who is an expert in the welfare and care of rare and endangered species. Now, Jake is not a horse expert, he's very plain about that, but he is an expert on caring for some of our most at-risk animals on planet Earth. So this is part one of our conversation with Jake. In this conversation, we are going to be covering concepts like animal happiness, the role of measuring welfare, and how sometimes in our quest to measure welfare, sometimes the tail ends up wagging the dog and can lead to quite bizarre outcomes. We're also going to be talking about things like the potential for maybe giving animals in captivity better welfare than their wild counterparts, which is a bit of a surprise. So we're going to be covering lots of ground in this first episode. We're not going to be talking too much about horses, but what this episode does is set everything up for our part two of our conversation with Jake, where we will be applying all of these interesting perspectives that Jake has developed over a long career of caring for rare and endangered animals to horses. So stick with us in part one of this conversation with Jake. I think you'll find it fascinating. We'll be talking about tigers and polar bears and other endangered species. So a really interesting conversation. And then come next week in part two, we'll pull it all together and apply it to horses and the horse industry. Meta and I are thrilled to bring you this episode, and we really hope you enjoy it. All right, then. So, hi, I'm Karen Luke.
And I'm Meta Osborne.
And welcome to this episode of our podcast, Changing Rain. I'm excited today about this episode, and I've been really looking forward to it for many weeks. It's taken a little bit of toing and froing to set it up because the three of us are all over the globe and we've got lots of time zones involved. But I'm hoping our listeners will find it incredibly interesting. I know I found our guest's work incredibly interesting when I came across it. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jake to Changing Rain. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, no problem. Glad to be here.
So Jake is the founder and CEO of Care for the Rare, an organisation that specialises in designing zoo enclosures for rare and endangered species. The reason we have invited Jake on to Changing Rain is we think he can give us one of our catchphrases on Changing Rain is perspective. So we think he can give us a different perspective about horse management, I guess, and keeping horses. So one of the things we're really interested in, Jake, is about people's journeys. So can you tell us how you came to have this very specialised job in caring for the rare?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me. What I should say is that actually Care for the Rare does a lot more than design habitats, and in fact, one of our principal kind of stakeholder groups that we work with are sanctuaries, so it's not just zoos, but we're an impact organization focusing on the interface between animal welfare and conservation. I am a passionate conservationist, but I'm equally passionate about welfare, and that's what Care for the Rare does. We deliver conservation impact, but we put it through very much the filter of animal welfare. And like I say, a key component of that is designing habitats and management systems that meet species needs. So my kind of journey to how I got to get to this point is I was like a lot of young kids at the age of 3 or 4, I was obsessed with dinosaurs, and I was just really kind of sad that I'd never see a triceratops, and rhinos were the nearest thing to that. So I became kind of really keen on rhinos, and even at a very young age, growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was aware that rhinos were kind of at risk, and so that was my foot in the door of deciding what I wanted to do when I grew up, which was conserving species, and I did a zoology degree, and I was due to start a PhD on black rhino in Zimbabwe, which got cancelled at the last minute because there was basically a massive poaching event in the where I was meant to be working in Zimbabwe, and it really highlighted for me the vulnerability of these populations in the wild. I had to very quickly find an alternative um, uh, thing to do because my PhD had fallen through. So I quickly found a applied animal behaviour and animal welfare course. I think it was the first of its kind anywhere in the world back at Edinburgh University. So I completed my master's on giraffe, and then I undertook a PhD in behavioural ecology at Glasgow University, and completed my PhD. I was lucky enough to be given a job running what was one of Europe's largest wild animal facilities, and spent a huge amount of time redesigning and redeveloping that, and bringing that academic background and experience of having worked with some of these species in the wild to designing habitats. I was acutely aware that I was coming up with design solutions that were just radically different from what anyone else was doing, and therefore they were really scary. And much of what I've been doing for the past 20 plus years is developing tools to give zoos and sanctuaries and people responsible for the welfare of animals the confidence to break out of the box of existing kind of management and design paradigms, because there's a tendency to replicate what we already do because, hey, this works. So let's just tweak that. But in reality, we know very few things are actually working. We see welfare challenges in all environments, and yet we use that as a basis to design new environments. And what we do is develop these tools to identify fundamental priorities and build on that.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating, Jake. In some ways, my story is the opposite in that I was an equine vet. I have been an equine vet for 40 years, over 40 years. But for an awful long time in that 40 years, I won't say I was oblivious to welfare, but I just thought health equaled welfare. I didn't really go beyond that. Yes, I actually am an Edinburgh alumnus too, in that I did the
Right.
International Animal Welfare and Ethics and Law Masters, and I finished that last year. And that kind of opened my
Right.
eyes to everything that's going on. And the first thing that you learn the first day you go in, they talk about welfare and the various definitions of welfare. And it's still probably not settled, but I'm just interested in what your conception of welfare is.
Yeah. It's. I mean, now you're in danger of really opening the floodgates because I could talk about this forever. So again, please feel free to interrupt. So, and I've done a lot of work on this, and it, it it really surprises me that whenever I go to a conference to talk about welfare, I'm the only one who appears to kind of say, this is what I believe welfare to be, because there is no universal definition of animal welfare. And the range of different welfare conceptions have profound impacts, really profound. And so I think there is a tendency for many organizations to develop what I call recursive welfare definitions, in that they are defining animal welfare by how it's measured rather than what it actually is. And from my perspective, animal welfare is exclusively about how an animal feels. It doesn't matter what its health is, so long as that animal feels good, its welfare is good. Now, it doesn't mean to say that physical health has no impact, because obviously if an animal is in a bad physical state, invariably it will feel bad. But health and welfare are not the same thing, and health is just one of a large range of metrics. Is a very important one, but it's a number. It's one of a large number of factors that influence how animals feel. And I always find it intriguing that we so often you see definitions relating to animal welfare reflects physical and psychological well-being, and it's always in that order. It's always physical and psychological. Now, the challenge is that we are better at measuring physical well-being than we are psychological well-being, and therefore, but because and I say we, it's not me, but because there is a tendency to define welfare by physical and psychological, and because physical welfare is easier to measure both on an individual level and at a population level, that tends to become a priority. And it's often done to the detriment of welfare. And the classic example I give of this is back in 2008, I believe it was, the state of California was passing through legislation in the state Farm Animal Welfare Act, which required farm animals have the opportunity to stand up and turn around, which is, it beggars belief that you would require legislation to enable animals to meet such a low bar. But nonetheless, the American Veterinary Medical Association, which is probably the biggest veterinary medical association on the planet, objected to this legislation on welfare grounds because their conception of welfare included, the ability to manage health. And they felt that these more complex environments come with, greater opportunities for animals to injure themselves, and more complicated health monitoring and management actually compromised welfare. So we had this bizarre scenario where the biggest veterinary medical association on the planet was objecting to animals having the opportunity to stand up and turn around on welfare grounds. And it's all about these flawed animal welfare conceptions that typically have their kind of basis in this kind of recursive thinking. So I'm going to stop it there because I could talk about this all day, but hopefully you'll kind of get the picture that, I'm a big defender of the concept of happiness. If we acknowledged that whilst happiness might be somewhat unscientific, it's a useful kind of sense check as a reference point in terms of welfare, because animal welfare is about the emotional, the affective states of animals.
Mm-hmm. Look, I can't speak for the AVMA, but I know that 40 years ago in final year vet, we had 1 hour of lectures on animal welfare. So there's a whole multiple generations of vets out there who really haven't thought about this and, concentrated on health because that's what they were trained to do. So, and I suppose I maybe had a bit of a light bulb moment. The reason I had the light bulb moment was probably because as a vet in a room talking about welfare issues, other people, lay people, would come to me and say, "You're a vet, you must know something about this." And the truth was I didn't. So I felt I needed to do something about it. And then got chatting to Karen because I'm very influenced by her work. And, I suppose we both feel that the whole area, the definitions, the concepts, people's understanding needs to be broadened, and maybe this podcast is one way of doing it. But
well, it's fantastic to sort of hear you acknowledge that, because I think it's actually quite rare for people to kind of accept that, and credit to you to acknowledge that journey that you've been on. Now, one of the other tools that we've developed is quite a sophisticated, multifaceted, whole facility welfare auditing tool. So, typically welfare assessments are, this narrative-based assessment of, an individual animal. We've developed a toolkit where we can assess welfare performance across an entire facility. And because we're using a different lens, we're using, a telescope rather than a microscope to look at welfare, we're getting a whole bunch of different kind of interactions than you could ever reveal by looking at a small number of individuals in a range of circumstances. And one of the things that we are consistently finding is that there is this tension between managing physical well-being and providing for psychological opportunities. Now, I conceptualized this back in the mid 2010s. I created this conceptual model that there was this tension between management geared towards protecting physical well-being and management towards providing for psychological opportunities. And we're now gathering data that is confirming this model. And it's not, I kind of curate the process, but it's never my data. It's not me who's inputting into this. So I'm not kind of skewing the results. But to kind of summarize this tension, the environments in which we keep animals that optimize healthcare could be typified by, small, simple environments. We can monitor animals, we can control inputs, and we can get hands-on and intervene really easily. The environments that provide animals the greater psychological opportunities are typically larger, they're typically more complex, they're typically more socially complex, more physically complex. And there is this inherent tension between the two. And this is why having this clarity about how we define welfare is so important, because so often, and particularly in North America, there's a tendency to maximize healthcare. It's not about optimizing it, it's about maximizing it. And you can never do too much. And animals get annual knockdowns and blah, blah, blah. And there isn't this kind of recognition that this actually comes with a welfare cost. And so rather than maximizing healthcare, we need to be looking at optimizing it. And like I say, this is something that I kind of conceptualized a number of years ago, but we're now getting the data that's really confirming it as a manifest reality in large wildlife attractions, and again across a whole range of species. We're not just talking about everything from jellyfish to elephants. This kind of tension is manifest.
Karen was the one who introduced me to your work, and that suggested bringing you on the podcast. And in my simplistic way, one thing that jumped out at me was the idea that potentially welfare can be better in captivity than in the wild. And I think you maybe mentioned that earlier on. Is this, am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, so if we kind of look at what animals experience in the wild and what animals experience in captivity, we are actually pretty good at providing healthcare. For the majority of species that we keep in captivity, they typically live longer than they would in the wild because, one, we can provide healthcare, but also, we do a pretty good job of de-risking the lives of animals. The reality is even if you take out anthropogenic kind of influences, the majority of animals born in the wild, even in pristine habitats, don't survive to reach adulthood, whereas in captivity, the vast majority do. So we can't ignore the fact that captivity does a good job at, by and large, at protecting physical well-being. So the challenge captivity presents is not in its ability to keep animals alive, but in satisfying psychological opportunities. And if we can create environments that provide for psychological opportunities, but also leverage the benefits that captivity can bring in terms of de-risking animals' lives and providing healthcare, actually I believe we should be relatively confident that we could provide a higher standard of welfare than most individuals would experience in the wild. And I'm not suggesting for a second that anyone is actually doing that systematically across the board for a whole range of species, but it should be the target that we aim for, because I believe, it is theoretically attainable, if not incredibly challenging to achieve. So it's that kind of concept is not intended to defend the status quo. It's to compel action to aspire to a much higher standard, because I think there is room for optimism in terms of welfare provisioning, but it requires a fundamentally different approach than the one that we typically see in terms of captive management.
I think you've been listening to podcast guests, because this is exactly the conversation we've been having. And we've kind of come to a view that there is, I call it headspace. We are where we are, but there is actually room for improvement, and that's a positive thing. That gives us cause for optimism.
Yeah, and again, this without wanting to go down a rabbit hole, I think that the biggest threat we face in terms of animal welfare is a defensive mindset, and I see it in and there are big regional differences. There is a tendency, particularly in the zoo community, to sort of defend against criticism rather than embrace the challenge of we need to do better. And from personal experience of having run, several large zoos, in various and indeed aquariums around the world, the public are very receptive towards kind of transparency in terms of where we're at and the direction we're going. And I think, people recognize, turning things around, there's a lot of inertia, magically improving welfare for species like elephants doesn't happen overnight. It's a decades long process of constructing new habitats and building up social groups, etc., etc. And people are surprisingly, I think, kind of supportive of that. And I think the biggest risk is really defensiveness, and we I think we see it. And again, there's an interesting kind. I think back in the 80s, there were concerns raised about the welfare of marine mammals in British and Irish zoos, so polar bears and cetaceans. There was a growing concern amongst the public and across the region. So, but the zoo community, the scientists, the regulatory authorities, there was a very cooperative kind of U4 funded research in zoos that couldn't have been done without the support of zoos. And in terms of cetaceans, certainly within the UK, guidance came out that mandated, specific standards for keeping of cetaceans in captivity. Didn't outlaw it, but they set specific standards from which the industry just said, we can't meet these, we're going to phase them out. With regards to polar bears, there was a transition from, a dozen or more small urban zoos to large, extensive wildlife parks. And so we saw a different response based on the capacity of facilities to provide for those needs. And it retained that social license for polar bears, and the average polar bear in the UK is now in a habitat, many orders of magnitude bigger than what they were before. So there's been a fundamental shift from small urban zoos to multi-acre wildlife parks. If we look at what's happened in North America, those same concerns about cetaceans were raised in the mid 2010s. And there was quite a defensive response to that. But the writing was on the wall back in the 80s. They should have seen this coming. They had 3 or 4 decades to kind of anticipate this, adapt management, reinvigorate facility design, and undertake the analysis and the work required to genuinely meet the needs of those species. And there was this very much, I believe, a defensive response, and that social license has been irrecoverably lost, and potentially rightly so. But the point is, there potentially was another route to this, but that hasn't yet happened. Well, it won't happen now for cetaceans, and probably rightly so. But that trajectory has still not yet played out for polar bears. It's astonishing that North America, much bigger place than the UK or Ireland, the biggest polar bear habitat in America certainly is significantly smaller than the smallest polar bear habitat in the UK. And one would anticipate that conversation is likely to be had down the road. So that defensive strategy not only, I think, does animals a disservice, but it's actually ultimately self-defeating. And I think it's essential to embrace the challenge and kind of lean into it.
I think that's just such an incredible insight, Jake. But what I'm curious about is, do you have any insight into why there were such different responses from the UK versus North America?
I mean, this is a whole massive can of worms. I think there is a tendency. So Europeans tend to study animal behavior through the lens of behavioral ecology. In North America, there's a greater tendency to look at animal behavior through the lens of behaviorism. And, some of the kind of underpinning sort of tenets about behaviorism: if you can't measure something, it doesn't exist. Even things like, the UK, for example, doesn't have a constitution. It has this kind of evolving Magna Carta-y kind of vibe, and everything's a little bit nebulous and vague and all of this, whereas in America, there's a constitution, it's very black and white. And I think there is a greater tendency in many, not all European countries, and obviously I hate to generalize, but when you've worked in different regions, there are some generalizations that hold true. There is a greater comfort with the shades of grey than there is in North America. And I think North America, there is a greater tendency to focus on the physical well-being, because it is the thing that is the most tangible. It is the thing that is most provable. And I think in the UK, there was a recognition that whilst we may not be able to measure whether these animals are happy, we kind of get it that they might not be, and we accept that and we respond accordingly. And I think in North America, the threshold for acceptance of that is potentially different. And there is this increased focus on physical well-being. And indeed, when the whole controversy about keeping cetaceans in captivity kind of blew up, following, the Blackfish documentary, the industry's defense was very much around, hey, we provide amazing healthcare. These guys live longer than they do in the wild, etc. And it kind of really missed where the concerns were coming from stakeholders, the community. They all of that might be true. They may live longer. They may have obviously better healthcare, but that's actually not what was concerning people. And I think that's kind of the difference there.
This is where your concept of the meaningful versus the measurable, is that what's at the back of that?
Yeah. So we it's I'm someone who kind of looks for sort of analogies. I can't help it. And it's like hearing what's I'm in Canada, but I still listen to sort of the BBC, and hearing how sort of healthcare based metrics are actually having unforeseen and bizarre kind of consequences. So one of the sort of healthcare metrics that they came up with was, waiting time at a hospital from the time you arrive in the hospital to the time you're treated in emergency cases, which at first seems a reasonable metric. But then, hospitals responded by not allowing patients to be removed from the ambulance until they had beds ready to meet these metrics. And so it's a classic example of the metric. We start managing for the metrics and not the actual patient outcomes. And it's the same with welfare. We have to be really careful about how we measure welfare. And again, I'm catching my own self out. We never measure welfare. We measure a variety of indicators from which we make welfare inferences. But the point being, we have to not confuse the things we use to inform welfare judgments. They can't kind of be the tail wagging the dog. They can't dictate management. And if they do, we need to actually kind of calibrate which has the biggest influence. And again, this is where a kind of welfare auditing framework is feeding into this process. In the we are identifying those parameters that are actually having the greatest influences on welfare outcomes, but inevitably they are the ones that are the most challenging to measure. You can't, it's not like measuring body condition or body weight or amino acid kind of contents of diets. All of these things are really comfort zone stuff. We can measure all of this stuff, but the things that actually really drive welfare are a lot more nebulous.
I recently read a paper, you might have seen it, Jake, which was looking at agency and the potential of agency as maybe being a bridge that is sort of between that nebulous side versus the very sort of hard metric side. Do you have any thoughts about that as a potential to sort of help us?
Yeah, for sure. So, and again, you'll hear about things like control and choice as being really important for welfare, and they are. But again, even here, we take this simplified kind of concept and we kind of run away with it and kind of assume that it's having all the welfare kind of impacts that we did because we're providing animals choices. Now, what I believe about these things is these choices have to be meaningful and relevant. Like, I've lived in various locations around the world, and the example I give is every time I move to a new country, the tyranny of choice when selecting toothpaste for the first time when you go to a supermarket and there are 700 brands, and it's like, oh my God, which is going to be my default? That's not a choice I appreciate. Not all choice is beneficial. Not all choice adds value. Not all choice has meaning. We can find choices between feeding opportunities, but if these feeding opportunities are 3 meters apart, there are no bad choices. There are no kind of impacts. And so, again, this thing about things like agency, choice, we have to recognize the potential value of that, but it's not this blanket, let's just provide a choice and we can tick that box. We have to engineer scenarios in which these choices have meaning and have relevance, and no doubt we'll get onto this. This is exactly what we are kind of doing for tigers at the moment in this kind of radically different habitat. And a key factor in in supercharging the value of choices and the significance of choices and the cognitive demands associated with choice is travel. Because in the wild, travel is the precursor to motivational equilibrium. Okay? And what we see is in captivity, animals are presented the physiological endpoints to everything they need. They're provided food, they're provided water, and, okay, we're now giving sort of puzzle feeders that they have to do sort of weird stuff to access it. But typically in the wild, animals travel to gain these opportunities. And what captivity does by compressing the space is eliminate these opportunities for travel. And travel takes up time, it takes up energy, it potentially exposes animals to risk. And that's where the cognitive demands and the consequences of bad choices come in. So using these animal welfare priority identification assessment that we've undertaken, we're seeing that intentional travel is consistently the most important behavioral priority for all species that isn't a direct physiological necessity. It takes up time, it takes up energy, and that animals don't waste time and energy in the wild, and that's a sign that it's of high evolutionary significance and something that we shouldn't ignore. And one of the other things sort of relating to this is our research is showing that, surprisingly, animals have quite a flexible relationship in regards to how much space they need. If you look at Asian elephants, for example, their home ranges can vary from, 3 or 4 square kilometers to, several thousand square kilometers. And it's the same with tigers. In the Sundarbans in India, tigers, different subspecies, but, all the same species. Tigers in the Sundarbans in the Indian subcontinent, their home ranges can be as little as 2 or 3 square kilometers. In the Russian Far East, they can be several thousand square kilometers. But what we actually see is, despite this massive variation in their home range size, the distances they travel are relatively fixed, including in captivity. The difference is, in captivity, there is very little opportunity for travel to be intentional, so it becomes manifest as stereotypic pacing. And so a key focus of what we are doing is reconnecting travel with goals and, as you say, agency. We see travel as this really important mechanism to add value to everything an animal does. Whether it's securing food, shelter, access to different physical or social circumstances, we want to kind of shoehorn travel as a mechanism to achieve that, because it adds value to everything.
Mm-hmm.
I promise we are going to talk about horses, but are you able just to give us a little bit of a taste of the sorts, how you are incorporating those into habitats for example, for tigers?
So we're doing this for a whole range of species. So the tigers is perhaps the most fun example. And what I should do is kind of dial it back a little bit and kind of explain a little bit about how we kind of come to the conclusions that we do in terms of what is important. So one of the challenges with I believe in terms of designing habitats and management systems is, if we want those to be based on evidence, we typically go out into the world and we look at all the captive tiger habitats, and we measure behavioral and maybe stress hormones, and we measure a whole bunch of parameters, and we try and correlate these with various environmental metrics. Now, it's really challenging to measure welfare. It's even more challenging to attribute cause and effect between the variations we get in particular metrics. But even if we were as good as we wished we were in measuring welfare and attributing cause and effect, this mindset only enables us to judge, the opportunities that captive animals experience. They systematically ignore things that captive animals can't express. We can't assess the value of migration. We can't assess the value of, for example, penguins deep diving. And so this evidence-based approach is structurally biased. It can only reference what captive animals currently experience. And so it always felt a flawed basis on which to devise any new habitat design or management system, because they could all be really bad, and all we're doing is judging, what's the best of a potentially really bad bunch. And so I came up with this animal welfare priority identification system, and it's premised on there being a relationship between evolution and animal welfare. The greater the evolutionary significance of a behavior or cognitive process, the more strongly and or more frequently that behavior or cognitive process is motivated, and therefore the greater the welfare consequence if animals are frustrated in expressing those behaviors. Now, it's not as straightforward as that linear relationship, because we also have to take into account where the stimulus for these behaviors and cognitive processes come from. So, for example, securing food is really important for survival and subsequently reproduction, but so is avoiding being eaten. But the difference between a lion wanting to eat a zebra and a zebra wanting to run away from a lion is the lion's desire to secure food comes from within the animal. The zebra's desire to avoid being caught by a lion that's chasing it is the perception of the lion. So, and in captivity, and this is again coming back to this peak welfare thing, we don't have to provide animals all of the things they experience in nature, because a lot of them are really bad. And so in captivity, we can be quite comfortable that if we can eliminate predatory attacks for zebras, there's no welfare downside to that, because we're eliminating, a negative opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be providing environments in which zebras feel they are empowered to escape predatory attacks were they to encounter them. That's really important. But the point is, because that stimulus is exclusively triggered externally, we don't have to, necessarily provide for those opportunities. So we assess all the major kind of behaviors and cognitive processes of a species by 16 or more criteria. We use expert panel assessments that combine welfare scientists, field biologists, and people who work with species in captivity. And we assess each behavior and cognitive process by these, 16 or more categories to evaluate their evolutionary significance, their motivational origins, and to evaluate, known welfare impacts where they are known. And this enables us to build up a relative ranking of the welfare significance of all of these behaviors and cognitive processes. So I'd worked with, in fact, my undergraduate research is on tiger welfare, and I'd looked at tiger behavior in five zoos and looked at the things that influence that. And so when we undertook this process for tigers, I thought I had a really clear picture of where things were going to go, because I just thought I knew it. But having gone through this process, the thing that surprised everyone, but then became really obvious, is that travel and information gathering was more important to tiger welfare than hunting. And that seems like, wow, that feels really random. But here's the thing. In the wild, tigers have a flexible relationship with hunting. if they find a carcass or they get an opportunity to steal food, their motivation to hunt is eliminated. So theoretically, a tiger doesn't need to hunt to survive, but a tiger does need to maintain a territory. And a tiger's territory is proportional to its prey density. That's the thing that dictates the territory size of a tiger. And so to understand how big a territory it needs to maintain, it needs to monitor prey density over time. It also needs to protect all of these resources from other tigers. So it needs to gather information about what's going on, within the neighborhood in relation to other tigers. It's also key to accessing reproductive opportunities. So tigers have a flexible relationship with how they acquire food, but a fixed relationship with information gathering. And so when you kind of understand this, your kind of management goals and objectives for this species fundamentally change. And because zoos never understood this, it was always been kind of understood that hunting was this really important thing because, they're big, scary tigers, they got big teeth, and for some reason we're kind of drawn to these elements, we recognize them as a big predator. And so the enrichment has been geared around kind of maximizing positive opportunities in relation to hunting. And so what zoos do is they create enrichment events in relation to food acquisition, and to maximize the number of those, they feed, they have these enrichment events once a day. They have these going up a feeding pole or going out into the habitat and searching for bits of meat. And to stop them becoming morbidly obese, obviously these meals are smaller than they would typically experience in the wild. And because these meals are smaller, captive tigers are rarely experiencing that species-specific stomach distension, a stretching of the stomach wall that they would experience in the wild when they're, consuming anything up to 20% of their body weight in a single meal. And the motivation to go looking for food in tigers is down to receptors in the stomach wall. If it's not stretched enough, they are permanently motivated to look for food. And so because the zoos never understood what truly mattered to tigers, they maximize these hunting opportunities in a way that precluded tigers from feeling full up in a species appropriate way, meaning they were permanently motivated to look for food in environments in which they were permanently frustrated from doing so. So I'm convinced the existing kind of conceptions of best practice for tigers are actually having a negative impact on tiger welfare. So we are devising habitats that reconnect travel and information gathering with kind of securing motivated outcomes. And what we see in kind of zoo design is this incremental kind of tweaking and finessing of what previous generations have done. The habitat we're kind of developing is so fundamentally different. It actually took an animal welfare NGO to kind of say, do you know what, we're going to give this a go. The science makes sense, and we're willing to invest in that, because I think it scared a lot of other people because it was so radically different.
Hi, it's Meta here. Wasn't that amazing? Jake had so much to say that we decided to split his episode into two parts. So that was part one. And in part two, we're going to hear more about how some of his thinking might be applied to the horse world. Jake professes not to be a horse expert, but certainly so much of what he has to say will resonate with those of us who are within that tent. His focus is probably on encouraging the horse world to be more proactive and not to configure what we think best practice is around what we've always thought best practice is, to maybe look a bit more at the horse's cognitive and behavioural needs. There's an awful lot in the next episode, so I really encourage you to stay tuned for that. In the meantime, don't forget to listen to our other episodes. They're all available on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, on Pocket Cast, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you're listening to, please subscribe, comment, and tell your friends, so that way we can spread the word. Thank you.